Welcome to the Molding Health Show. Our goal is to leverage the wisdom and experience of healthcare practitioners to set you on a path of self-discovery and healing. These insights, coupled with a multidisciplinary approach to each area of interest, should provide an invaluable resource to everyone looking for a better approach to health. Hi, everyone. So we're going to be going through private practice management as one of the modules within the IsoLearn platform. And well, this particular course is actually split up into a few modules. And Ingrid James is going to be taking us through that. Welcome on board, Ingrid.
Thank you, Oliver. Thanks for having me today. So private practice is always such an amazing opportunity for healthcare practitioners to talk about once they've done their training. And I just remember, not so much of fondness, I must add, my dilemmas in terms of going into private practice. So today I'm hoping that our conversation helps to ease some of these anxieties and some of these really stressful times for new practitioners, as well as for practitioners that have been around for quite a while, but feel quite stuck. So going into private practice management is always a difficult thing. You know, as a practitioner, you have so many things that you have to consider. I wish it were just as simple as, you know, you do your training as a healthcare practitioner and then you're set to go. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. Much of our training really doesn't help us in terms of equipping us with the necessary information or the skills that we need in terms of going into private practice. So often we have the experience of we've gone into university, we've done the degrees, we've gotten our qualification with HPCSA, and then we look around and we say, I want to go into private practice, but I don't know how. So hopefully going through the material today, we'll be able to say, we give you a start point. We certainly give you much food for thought with regards to what you should be considering. And hopefully that makes that journey easier for you. So let's get into it. So this is a little splurge about me in terms of how I actually got into private practice. And, you know, a lot of the experience that I've had, you know, stems over the period from 2005. So, you know, some of it will be relevant irrespective of which decade you start a private practice in. But hopefully what we do today is just looking at different phases of practice will also help in terms of making management of practice a lot more simplified and accessible to people. I think the first thing that we need to do when we think about going into private practice is really just having a strategy and mapping out your journey. Each of us as private practitioners have different ways of how we want to do things. We have different visions for ourselves, and most certainly we have different ideas of how we're going to come into private practice. So the first thing that I would often say to people that is probably the most important, and some of us have had exposure to this during training, and it's really just looking at, you know, what is the National Healthcare Act of South Africa and the Health Professions Act of South Africa, which is the 1974 Act, okay? And both of these become the guidelines and the foundations with regards to how to set a private practice. With the National Health Act of 2003, really what it does is it provides a framework in which there's a uniformed healthcare system for each person in the Republic, and what they have access to as patients and what we are supposed to provide as practitioners. And anything that it has to, not any matter that's connecting to this, either as a patient, a practitioner, a service provider, whatever it is, you know, the National Healthcare Act tends to cover it, okay? With regards to the Health Professions Act of 1974, most of us know it predominantly from the ethical guidelines, and it really governs our behavior as practitioners. So everything that you do in private practice that is either a yay or a nay is governed by the Health Professions Act. We go through a lot of this during internship, CompServe, And those of us that have written board exams, most of the board exam is actually based on the ethical guidelines. The ethical guidelines are incredibly important, and the importance of this is emphasized over and over again in terms of us needing to do CPD points, and for most practitioners, we need to do a minimum of 6 ethical points per year. I'm hoping that when we go through some of these guidelines, in terms of trying to set up private practice, what you get an idea of is also the things that, seem to be fairly common and common knowledge, but it has its basis with regards to how you set up private practice and how you conduct yourself as a healthcare practitioner. So let's get into the first one, and this is the naming of a practice. So how do you name your practice? And it's so important because this becomes the way that you are identified in terms of your industry, in terms of your community. It becomes part and parcel of your reputation. And, later on, it becomes everything that your patients or your clients associate you with. So choosing a name for your practice is incredibly important. You can do it in terms of your own name. So, for example, my practice is called Ingrid Nagia, Trading as Clinical Psychologist, because I'm a sole proprietor, which means that I don't have any partners and I really just work off my own name. Okay. You can also be a part of a partnership. You could go into partnership with other people, or you could actually, and you could come up with a name. For example, it could be something like clinical psychologist in private practice, for example. Okay. The most important thing about it is that you need to have something that identifies your practice going forward. With regards to the second rule around this, it talks to how to retain the name of your private practice. So say, for example, in my case, I started out under my maiden name, and that was Ingrid James. And then I got married, and my maiden name obviously moved to my married surname. But if I set up private practice as Ingrid James, trading as clinical psychologist, I could take that going forward. I could keep that going forward because that becomes my brand. Okay. The third thing that you need to know is that in terms of setting up a name for your practice, you cannot have anything that pertains to the expression of hospital, clinic, or institution. Okay, so those are the no-goes in terms of how to name your private practice. So I can't have a clinic of clinical psychologies, for example, or a clinical psychology practice. A clinical psychology clinic. I can't say that in terms of naming. Okay. With regards to acceptable business models, as I said to you previously, I'm a sole prop or a sole proprietor, which means that there isn't anybody else that is part of my practice. I practice by myself. You could have partnerships, groups, or organizations. You could have associations, personal liability companies such as PTYs. Unfortunately, for healthcare practitioners, we don't necessarily use PTYs. HPCSA generally says we should rather go the Inc. route, which is incorporated practices. Okay, with PTYs, it doesn't offer us the same kind of cover that it would give other directors, because according to the National Healthcare Act and the Health Professions Act, liability always remains with us as practitioners. Okay, something else to keep in mind in terms of inks, you can only set up an ink if you have other practitioners that are of your profession. So I would only be able to set up an ink with other clinical psychologists or psychologists. I won't be able to set up an ink with a dietitian, for example, even though we both belong to HPCSA. Okay. Franchises are subject to compliance with ethical rules, and that is always a tricky one. I don't really know of any healthcare or health professionals franchises that are out there. They're generally quite few and far between. Any of these business models may be can outsource their administration or the the business part to other companies in order to manage administration and billing and that sort of thing. And according to HBCSA, that is acceptable. Okay, so what would we like to get out of this particular conversation? The one thing that we would like to do is certainly understand our philosophies to be able to get maximum value out of this program. And that's with regards to how to set up private practice and run a sustainable, ethical practice. The second thing that we want to be able to do is put a plan in place for your private practice. The third thing that you will get an introduction to is to learn or know a little bit more about your financial numbers. The fourth thing is to learn about company structures so that you can decide whether they are acceptable or applicable to you. And the fifth thing is to be able to track the progress of your plan and hence the progress in terms of how your private practice is growing. So our philosophies, before we start the program, it's important for you to understand our philosophies to ensure that you get maximum benefit of this particular program. It's important to say that there's no single way or answer with regards to the best way to set up a private practice. What we're offering you is an opportunity to see our approach and how we guide people in terms of being able to set up private practice. And then you can decide, which parts of this you want to use and make it part of your own journey going forward. So the first thing that we talk about is getting value from information. So, I'll be the first to admit that there is a lot of information out there. All you have to do is Google private practice and you will be bombarded with all sorts of things. How much of it is applicable to us is sometimes questionable. How much of it has HBCSA guidelines in play with regards to considering those kinds of things is also something that is questionable. And it makes it difficult as a practitioner to decide, what am I going to take into consideration? What can I use? What can I apply? And what to discard? So for us as a team, often what we do is we get information from the various forms and formats. It comes from books, from courses, mentorship, supervision, all sorts of different ways of being able to upskill on this particular thing. So, the second philosophy that Kitrin has is to talk about the hero's journey. And a lot of the time you would hear, if you have been part and parcel of some of our podcasts and that sort of, our Molding Health show, you would have heard about the hero's journey. And a lot of the time it is about being able to see how we actually fit into the hero's journey. So to explain a little bit more of this, I'm going to invite Oliver to tell us a little bit about the hero's journey.
Thanks, Ingrid. So the first time I heard about the hero's journey, I was in awe because everything kind of made sense. I mean, I was a huge, reader and, love to watch movies. And, when they explained it in terms of what the hero's journey is, everything kind of made sense. And they say, like any good story follows that blueprint. And it's essentially something like this, that the hero sets out on this journey and he doesn't really know that he or she's going on this journey. And so they normally refer to the hero as the reluctant hero because they normally get kind of pushed into the situation and they kind of have to make it work. And so how we relate this to private practice is that, the practitioner goes into private practice and now they are on this journey. And the important point with it always is that, the hero always seeks guidance from a guide or someone that's done it before. And, throughout our journey, we kind of see this is that, the practitioner is always like looking for, the guidance from maybe another practitioner in terms of supervision or mentorship or anything like that. And they kind of get this and normally it's someone that's done it before. So this could be one of those parts in terms of, guidance. And along with that is these tools and resources that the hero needs to be able to, complete this quest. And so through that journey, the hero, faces lots of trials and tribulations and challenges and stuff like that. But they do at some point get to the end of the journey. And I think I like that because even the word journey is because it's a process. And I think every practitioner agrees that it's never, it's never like done in a month, in a year, maybe even 10 years. They're constantly evolving, and it's just the nature of it. But I think the point with this as well, with the hero's journey, is like there's actually, through the process, and later on I actually realized, and through much more reading, it was actually the hero's two journeys. And the hero's two journeys are that the first one is actually getting into private practice as an example, and that's a journey. The second one is a lot more like, it's a lot more, you don't really see it, but it actually happens. And that's the transformation of the hero themselves or heroine. So in this case, the practitioner, by virtue of setting off on this journey of going into private practice, actually becomes a better person and actually becomes a better therapist. And I think that's quite important. But that's only one part of the story. The other part of the story is like your clients or your patients are also going through their own journeys, and you become the guide for them in their transformation. And I think if you take those two hats on it and think about it, I mean, it becomes pretty profound in terms of how you think about things, how you think about your own private practice, and how you think of that whole process of, finishing that journey, even with all of its challenges. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I do think that like the hero's journey is something that is applicable to everybody, right? It's not just about private practice. We each have our own journeys with regards to becoming parents, for example. And, we become the guides for our children, but we always rely on other books, mentors, therapy ourselves as parents to be able to figure out how to make this journey something that we can all benefit from and grow from. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. So in terms of the hero's journey pertaining to private practice in particular, so yes, it is about either being the hero that goes under transformation and becomes a better version, or it is about us becoming guides for our patients so that they can get the best out of the therapy that we're offering. Okay, so the third philosophy is without a plan, there is no execution and no satisfaction. So we've heard a little bit about the hero's journey. We've talked a little bit about the fact that we go through this great expedition in terms of having training and being exposed to different types of patients as we are going through our training. We endeavor to be the best that we can be in terms of students at university level. And now we need to be able to figure out, well, what's the plan going forward? So how do we come up with a plan with regards to private practice? So there are many metaphors that we can use in terms of being able to understand the value of planning. But some of our favorites are the ones from Abraham Lincoln as well as Albert Einstein. So Lincoln once said, give me 6 hours to chop down a tree and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. Or for example, Einstein said, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'll spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and about 5 for the solution. Okay, so giving yourself time and space to be able to think about your plan is not wasted effort, and it's certainly not wasted time. Because what it does is it gives you an opportunity to be able to map out for yourself exactly how you see yourself moving forward. Are there going to be trials and tribulations? Absolutely. It's part and parcel of the journey. But if we don't have a plan, then we're running around in circles and we really don't know what is it that we are aiming for going forward. Okay, so the fourth philosophy is about finding and knowing your purpose. I think that just in terms of my own experience with regards to becoming a private practitioner, I've always known that I wanted to be a psychologist. But did I know specifically which area of psychology I wanted to work in? No, that came much later. Did I know going into private practice that I wanted to focus on a particular area? No, I was generalist. But our experiences and exposures to different types of patients, as well as different types of processes, definitely helps us to try and figure out exactly what is it that we want to do. I'll give an example. So when I was doing my internship, I had exposure to a young girl who was about 14 at the time, and had a really severe case of anorexia. And it began my journey in terms of wanting to work with patients that had eating disorders. It was a severe case to the point that we really didn't know whether she was going to make it through. Fortunately, she did. But at that time, I was struck by the fact that there were very few resources out there. Now, I'm talking about 20 years ago, where we really didn't know as much about eating disorders as we do now. So finding and knowing your purpose is certainly a journey. And it from my own experience, I find that it certainly changes with time and with your own life experiences. So how do you find your purpose? You need to be able to answer a few questions. The first of it is, what do you love doing? In my case, I love doing clinical work. So I know that I want to do clinical work. I don't really want to do much else. What am I really good at? I'm good at clinical work. Will it pay me money? Yes, it does. Okay. And would it make the world a better place? Well, I hope so. I think from my patients and my experiences of it, I certainly hope that I have done my best in terms of making the world a better place. So this is based on the Japanese principle of ikigai. And where you have these 4 principles, the intersection is where you find ikigai. For most of us, that is not necessarily the perfect intersection all the time, but most certainly it's the ideal that we strive to achieve. Okay, so the 5th philosophy is that it's not that difficult to make 80,000 Rand per month in your private practice. I'm going to let Oliver explain a little bit of this, because when it comes to the money stuff, I'm not the best.
Yeah, so typical healthcare practitioners obviously hate talking about money, but I think even putting out 80,000 rands, I mean, it could be anything. And I think what we've seen a lot in private practice is practitioners saying, if they could make as much as 30,000 or 40,000,
Yes.
Would be amazing. And I think although we put 80,000 there, I mean, it could be any number. I just find 80,000 is a really good salary. I mean, it's also quite intentional because it's just below the VAT threshold. If you don't ever want to get into the VAT part, which is like 1 million rands in South Africa, I'm not going to go into that because, speak to your financial advisor or your tax person or your financial or your accountant, about that stuff. And that's why, I say that 80,000 is also a really good income. And, we put out some links there in terms of like in South Africa, what that would mean in terms of where you would be from an economic point of view. But I think the important one is, irrespective of whether that's 80K or 30K or 40K, is what Ingrid will go through is on how do you do that. And I think that's the important part. How many sessions does it mean? How much of work do you have to do? Do you have to work weekends? All of those things. Do you have to work evenings? So I think the biggest one with this, although there is a number on the slide, that number could be whatever. And I think we justified 80K, as I said now, and as you'll see with those resources, but it could be anything. Does that make sense?
And I think it does. So I do think that, it's nice to be able to put a figure down to what you would find as, your private practice being successful. So it's really not about the number 80,000, but it is about what is going to make your life comfortable. So for example, if, let's say for argument's sake, your session, you do a half an hour session and it's 500 Rand, you would take, let's say 30,000 is the number that you want to be able to use, as your life would be really comfortable. If you were earning 30,000, you take 30,000, you divide it by 500, and that would be the number of sessions that you would have to do in order to be able to hit your target. So it's really not so much about, like Oliver says, 80,000 as the ideal, and that's the only thing that's going to make a successful private practice. It really is about, what is it that you as a practitioner need? Some of us are married or we have partners, and, this is the secondary income as opposed to the primary income. So maybe we do not, because we're raising young children, or we are on maternity leave, or, we're doing the school runs, whatever the case is, maybe 80,000 is not necessarily realistic, because we do want some sort of balance as well. So whatever that figure is, it is about trying to have an idea in mind with regards to how much do I need to work as a practitioner in private practice in order to be able to feel comfortable and, be in a position where you are, you do still have the level of financial independence that you want. Okay. Okay, sorry. So, like Oliver mentioned, the 80,000 is less than the VAT threshold, and to a large extent, VAT is something that is necessary if you are making more than R1 million a month. But most often than not, private practitioners don't necessarily want to go to that extent because it does become a pain in terms of like having to have another thing in mind. Most often than not, though, if you have set up an Inc., the chances are you are going to hit that VAT threshold and you are going to have to register. Okay. Like I mentioned, the fact that, you might be one of two part family income. And a lot of the time you have to be able to think about as a private practitioner, because the work is often emotionally draining. How do you balance that out with your personal health as well? Okay. So what are the stages of private practice? We're talking about naming a private practice, or firstly deciding on getting into private practice. Then we've talked a little bit about naming your private practice. We've talked about, what sort of business model does the private practice follow? And now we're talking about the life stages of a private practice. So initially, this is not necessarily, I want to say, absolutely standardized with regards to the timeframes, but most often than not, as you start a private practice, you have gone through some degree of shift and change in your private practice that gives you an idea as to how your practice has been growing from strength to strength. So initially, obviously, it's the inception phase, which is, making the decision to go into private practice and actually doing it. So too often we have people that say, I really want to go into private practice. I want to go into private practice. And you might be working for somebody else, or you might be working for state and you have a desire to go into private practice, but actioning it is not something that really happens as easily. The actioning of going into private practice happens after you have a plan, because it's too difficult to think about not having the guarantee of an income. The second phase or stage of private practice is what we consider a startup. And this is where you've worked out the kinks of all of the other things that we've just mentioned. And now you've also figured out how do you get patients or clients to come into your private practice, and you start generating an income. In the startup phase, it's not necessary that you are making the amount of money that you would like to in terms of being absolutely comfortable from a financial point of view, but you're working out the process of how to market and get your services out, advertise your services, and get clients in through the door. The stage of growth is the third stage, and this is really just about being able to get your private practice to the level that you want for yourself. And this involves, do you want to expand? Do you want to have more than one private practice? There was a stage, I think, when I had rooms in 2 or 3 different places at the same time. Some of my crazy ideas with regards to expansion. The thing I overlooked was there was only one of me. So I was running around like a headless chicken from one practice to the next, to the next, to the next. And I spent so much of time in the car that it actually wasn't really worth it at that time. The fourth stage of private practice is maturity. And this is when you've gotten to the point in your private practice where you are very comfortable with the amount of income that you are generating, with the type of work that you're doing, and with the number of patients that are coming in through your door. You're not absolutely stretched thin to the point where, for example, it is impossible to think about taking time off, or it is difficult for you to be able to think about sick leave or anything like that, So maturity is more about practice being stable. It becomes stable and it becomes predictable. The fifth stage of practice is often one that is not really, well documented or talked about. And this is dissolution of the practice. And, it is a difficult topic, I guess, for most practitioners because, you think about starting up and you think about getting going and you think about maturity and growth. But do you ever think about what am I going to do if I'm not able to run private practice anymore? I'll give an example. As we get older, we may have more health issues and we may not be able to run private practice. Have we really thought about what's going to happen to our patients? What's going to happen to the venue that you have? If you own your own building, who do we refer our people onto? So the solution is all about, getting to that phase where there are either personal changes, life kind of interrupts and it changes your plans from what you would have liked to do to possibly what's happening right now, or we get towards retirement. So if if you decide to retire at 50, for example, and you've been in private practice for 25 years, you would have amassed a whole following and you have a reputation that you've established over 25 years. You don't just up and leave and disappear, because we have a responsibility to people. As private practitioners, we have to keep records and work, records of what we've done for 6 years. If we work with children, for example, it is 21 years and longer. Because they're minors when we see them. So we need to keep it up until they're adults. So we don't, what do we do with all of that stuff? So the solution is all about how do you dissemble as opposed to assemble private practice.
Ingrid, if I can just say one thing on that as well, and I think you brought my attention to it at one stage, is that I think practitioners don't also take into consideration what happens if something happens to them in terms of their current client base as well.
Yes.
And I think it's almost having a backup plan for that. If you were going to hand the therapy over to another practitioner, has the other therapist or practitioner is aware of that? Do they have the details for that person? How would they get the details? All of those things. So I think always bear that in mind. I mean, in South Africa, you're seeing a lot of immigration related stuff. What happens with the patients? And I think if you spend a lot of time building up your private practice, and for instance, you have a website, you have people constantly looking for therapy, that's worth something as well. And again, this is not financial advice or anything, but think of everything as tied to your private practice and what you've built. And at some point, if it goes away, what happens? And I think, so it's a bit of a deeper topic. And obviously very relevant, but as you said, not documented. I don't see many practitioners talking about it. So it's this unwritten rule that everything will be fine, but obviously it's not. So yeah, just my point on that.
I suppose something else, Oliver, is that, when we're younger, we feel invincible and we don't really think about our own untimely demise. But when you become a practitioner, you do have to think about what happens to your people, because even in the event of your death, for example, your patients cannot be abandoned. They still need care. Particularly if you are in the process, in the practice of therapy, where we have long-term patients, you cannot just disappear, be here the one day and then you're gone the next. So stage 5 is a really, really important aspect. And I think that it is important for people, even before you begin private practice, to start thinking along the lines of, it's not just about getting people in through the door, and they go out another door. If you have been that part of their support structure, we have to think about how do we do this in an ethical and responsible way going forward. Okay, so planning is difficult. As we've already established, it's not always easy to be able to sit down and have foresight with regards to exactly what is it that you want to create. But, I'm of the opinion that you can put down a general plan and of course, life is going to force changes on your blueprint, and you adapt, you modify, and you move on from that. So, it's also important to be able to have the capacity to say, okay, this is what I set down for myself. And then after a 3-month of doing something in that particular direction, to come back and say, okay, how long or how far am I off the mark? How do I track my progress with regards to what I want to do and what I'm trying to create? So, general kind of like goal setting that most people are aware of is a good idea. To be able to have a mind map for yourself is always nice. I like the idea, like it is here, of a vision board. It doesn't have to be a massive thing that is, unattainable, but certainly to put it down in your personal journal, to write in your diary about it, and also just to be able to give yourself the opportunities to constantly add to your vision board. So, a really nice exercise is to be able to, and I know it's put down here as homework assignment, right? Is to be able to decide on, what do you want out of the first year of your private practice? Decide what you would like to have in your private practice within the first year. And then also do another plan for from year 1 to year 3. And then possibly past year 3. For me as a private practitioner, for example, year 1 was one of the most difficult years, not from a financial perspective. I was very fortunate that I had private practice that became, lucrative quite quickly. But from an anxiety point of view, I was one of those practitioners that was certainly, not quite convinced I had enough knowledge and, that I was offering the best care that I could possibly have. When you are a new practitioner in private practice, you have to surround yourself with people that are going to be able to support and have your back. So supervision is amazing, to belong to groups, to be able to do the CPD training, to be able to have a mentor, to be able to have somebody that kind of like looks at your business and says, I think you need to put more effort in here, to have a marketing consultant, for example, that comes up with a marketing plan, because I don't really want to do that. I just want to do what I want to do, which is really just about being a clinician. So making it as detailed as possible gives you an opportunity to be able to say to yourself, okay, this is what I have in terms of my vision. And then when we do a reflection on it, we can say, okay, but this is what I've accomplished. And then we can build on that. You can look at what's worked and what hasn't worked, for example. And then the stuff that hasn't worked, you discard. Okay. Knowing your numbers. Now, every practitioner who works in the healthcare space needs to know numbers. What kind of numbers are we talking about? Are we talking about just how much of money do you want to earn? How much of income do you need in order to be able to survive with regards to being able to pay all of your bills as well as being financially independent? I wish that, were the only things that we need to talk about. But if you have a partner, for example, there are all sorts of expenses that come into play. So, you find that knowing what your practice is doing and how much you are able to earn as an income out of it is really important at any phase of your life, as well as different stages of the practice. For example, when you first start out and you're a single person, you just have to look after yourself. And then you get married, for example, and then you have children. And before you know it, we've got car payments, we've got house payments, we've got living expenses, we've got medical aid, we've got children expenses with regards to childcare or school fees or whatever the case is. So these things actually change as we get older and, our lives move on and we have more people in our lives that we look after. So it's important to be able to see that your growth in your practice is actually matching the expenses as the expenses grow. Okay, so that you're not feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm working so hard, but I have nothing to show for it. So knowing your numbers are quite important. I can tell you from my own experience in terms of being a practitioner, it's the last thing I want to look at. I don't want to look at what the numbers are, but over the years, I've learned that it's important to be able to do that in order to feel like you have some kind of handle on what's happening in your practice.
Mm. And Indra, if I can say something as well, again, from a, non-practitioner kind of view,
Mm.
is that I think knowing the numbers is important, because then you're not just relying on other people to tell you what that is. And I think, and I've heard this story so many times, where practitioners say that, that's why I have an accountant, or that's why I have a financial advisor. And those guys, those people are amazing. I mean, they're professionals at what they do, and all of that good stuff. But at a high level, you should know what that is, and you should be directing the conversation in terms of, how would how would you want your retirement aspects to look like? How would you want to live, have your current living expenses look like? And I think that's the one part to it. And then the other part is this part of, we never get trained. It doesn't matter whether you're, maybe the accountants are better at this, but for the large part, most of us is, like as adults, we terrible with money. And it's about having that top of mind, and also understanding how money works, and there's many causes on this stuff, but the basic rule is that, you should have contingencies in plan. And I think that's why we put that contingency part there. Again, it could be 15%, it could be 30%. I worked with someone who said he half lived what he earned, and which is amazing, which is basically, whatever he had, I mean, he took half of it and he saved it. And that very few of us have that discipline. But I think when you, with this slide, I think the biggest point is that you should know the numbers rather than, someone else telling you what that is. You should know what it currently is, and you should know what it should be. And I think if you can get to that stage, you're doing amazingly well, and you're probably better than, almost 80% of people that you see around you, whether that's a practitioner or otherwise.
And that I guess the point that is also quite important about this, Oliver, is the fact that, financial planners are amazing at what they do, and they are incredibly professional, but they're not always aware of all of the shifts and changes in your life, and the demands on you financially that have shifted and changed. So it's not like we call up our financial planners every time there's the birth of a child, or, for example, you've had health issues. Okay, maybe you do with health issues because you might have insurance that you might want to claim, right? But, or you want to buy a new house or a new car. You don't necessarily always speak to your financial planner about that. So they have an overview. They don't have the details. So if you're not holding on to the details with regards to how your practice ebbs and flows, it will become very difficult. So it is important to be able to, as practitioners, have enough of an overview with regards to our own practices. And we're not just, I want to say, moving or shifting that responsibility over to somebody else, because, that person is not going to be able to look after your stuff in the way that you need to, because you know the ins and outs of your personal circumstances. Okay. The other thing that I would like to add here is that I found in my own experience, being able to have an overview, just a snapshot of my private practice helps with, not worrying about different things. When you are self-employed, you don't work, you don't get paid. So holidays are really, really expensive. Number one is that you have to pay for a holiday going away. And number two, you're not earning any money in that time. So over the years, you learn that if you've got an overview of what's happened in your practice and how much of income has come in, then you don't stress because you're able to budget accordingly. You know that, okay, I'm going to be going on leave for 4 weeks, for example, when it's school holidays. And, I've spent the last 6 months making sure that I can cover all of my bills and I don't have to worry. So it's really important to be able to do that. It empowers you. Okay. So running a business in private practice is not easy. Private practice is a business. And, a lot of the time as practitioners, we don't really want to say that private practice is a business. There are two aspects to it. There's the clinical work that we do, which obviously doesn't feel so much like business because it is about developing relationships with people and with our patients. But everything else that goes around it in terms of being able to invoice and, collect on that particular invoice and make sure that you have a steady income. That part is definitely about running a business. And there's so many things to consider, so many hats to wear. It's very difficult if you are kind of like, sort of like not in charge with all of these or up to speed with all of these things. I know that when I first started up in private practice, I did the ostrich head in the sand thing when it came to the running the business part. And a lot of the time I would stress out my husband because I wouldn't really invoice on time and I wouldn't be able to, earn an income really. And over the years, the longer that I've done this, you learn very quickly that's not sustainable, right? And you have to surround yourself with people. If you can't do this part, you have to surround yourself with people that can run the business aspect of private practice for you. As a practitioner, I think that there's a lot of pressure on us to be able to do everything well. So, you don't want to take the calls from the irate parent that says, but I have paid you. Why are you sending me this invoice that does not reflect a payment? If that's not your forte, rather outsource that stuff. Me personally, I just want to do the clinical work. I really don't want to deal with half of the business stuff. Yes, I want an overview and I don't relinquish complete control on my practice, but I also don't want to spend, hours and hours till 10 o'clock at night looking at all of these things and thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I have to send out this invoice or I have to reflect a payment because I don't really have the time and space to be able to do that. So, sorry, Oliver, you wanted to say something?
No, I just want to say, I mean, like, and I read a really good book on this, and I think it was called Simplify. And what the talks about is, what's the job you're trying to do? And I think with healthcare practitioners, especially the ones that are going into private practice, it's quite complicated. And I think,
Yes.
like when healthcare practitioners look at this, they should actually think about it as well. What is their job? And in our mind, it is the obviously the therapy work. It's the continuous learning and getting better as a therapist, and then it's also the like figuring out how in private practice you can get referrals and make sure your private practice is at the levels that you want it to be. But other than that, except for keeping, as you very clearly said, keeping oversight of what needs to be done, is that what you want to be doing? And I think it's easier, I think, when you're younger, but as you get as children kind of come into the mix and life and things like that, I think you really have to look at it and say, is that something that I really want to keep responsibility for and do? And if it's not, figure out a way that you can get that done. And there's many ways to do that. I mean, that's not the point of the slide, but there are ways that you can do this. But from a mindset point of view, it's very clear that you understand, like, what is your job as a healthcare practitioner in private practice? And if that job is to do every single thing, you're going to run out of time. And if you, at that stage, I think go back to the question as well, what is your job as a healthcare practitioner in private practice? So yeah, that's what I want to say.
So I think the distinction to be made here is that in private practice, you most certainly have to use, you have many hats to wear, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do everything. So you don't have to do everything. So being a clinician, offering the best care possible, making sure that I am up to date with, therapy skills out there, making sure that I am aware of the different trends and what is out there and available is most certainly, something that is my responsibility. Offering the best quality of patient care that I can offer is my responsibility, and that I must do. But do I need to do my taxes when I can hire a tax consultant to do that? Do I need to, be billing my clients if I can hire a billing company to do that? No, I don't. I need to have oversight and I have responsibility, but not necessarily that I have to do. So, I mean, it is difficult with regards to what do you hold on to and what don't you, but most certainly experience in terms of running private practice the way that you want to run it, will certainly guide and dictate according to those lines. So, Okay, so coming back to the slide, there is one book that is recommended by Michael Gerber, and that is The E-Myth Revisited. And in this book, he talks about being a technician, a manager, and an owner. So, he's also talking about being multifaceted, multidimensional with regards to all of these different responsibilities. And that's what we're drawing on the comparison to in terms of private practice. So, the owner has all of these responsibilities and understandings around the actual running of the business, but not necessarily that you have to do every aspect. So just putting this down gives you an opportunity to appreciate that, firstly, it's not trivial to run private practice, absolutely. And, complexities come with more diverse work. So for example, as a practitioner, if you are in private practice alone, it's fairly standard with regards to you have one location where you're seeing all of your patients, and that's that. If you're adding to it that you're going to be doing hospital work, for example, then you have more than one location and you have different billing processes for each place. And then you might add on to that you're going to be running groups, which adds more and more complexity. So you do want to be able to decide for yourself as a practitioner, what am I able to do? What am I going to be good at? And the things that I'm not going to be do good at, you most certainly want to minimize or get support and assistance for it. A company structure. So as a healthcare practitioner, you don't have too many options with regards to the company structure. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the PTY, and in terms of it allows limited liability. Okay, in terms of healthcare practitioners, they just lift the veil of PTY and they're going to hold you accountable anyway. So it's not really going to offer you, for example, what a normal secular business is going to offer. HPCSA definitely allows you to trade as a sole proprietor, and that is in your own rights. Okay, I think often it is important to be able to establish that being a sole prop doesn't necessarily mean, for example, you can't have a business account. You can go to the bank and open up a business account with the bank. You don't have to have a savings account in your own name. You can still be a sole proprietor. Like we said, HPCSA advocates for sole prop, partnership, or incorporated. And the reason for this is because these companies don't offer you that limited liability that HPCSA does not recognize. Okay. If there's one partner in private practice, it's our recommendation that you go sole prop. And the reason for that is that it's less work with regards to tax complications and that sort of thing. And it gives you the benefits of having private practice, as well as being able to see, what are the expenses that you're going to outsource to the business. And if you want to add anything to that, Oliver.
No, I think you covered the point quite nicely about the company structures, and I think just to make sure we cover this from a liability perspective, or further insight, is I think speak to your accountant and speak to I think just bear the principles in mind, but speak to your accountant and see what's in the best interest of you in terms of how you want to structure your your company or your private practice. But essentially, it's just worth noting that there's different company structures, and it's worth noting, what do you want to take out of it? As you said quite nicely, Ingrid, a few times, is that the easiest is a sole proprietor. If you're unsure, just go with that. The common ones after that is the Inc. You want to steer away. From our experience of working with other clients, obviously steer away from the PTY aspects of that, based on what the HPCSA doesn't want. And everything else, just speak to one of those professionals and see if they can guide you through the conversation as well.
I do think that it's important to also note that you can start off as a sole prop, and then you could always change the business structure later on if your practice it needs that. So for example, if your practice has grown incrementally and you have hired new people, and you have more than one location, for example, it might warrant more than sole prop, but it can grow alongside you. Okay, tracking your progress. So, like we established initially, that it's important to be able to have a plan so that we can actually just measure the growth that we have according to what the plan was initially. And, being able to track progress and measure progress is not as easy, because I think that often it feels like, people don't have the time to be able to do the reflection, but it's important to be able to do. So some of our recommendations around this is to be able to write down your goals for each year at the beginning of each year. These are the New Year's resolutions that often we kind of like avoid doing. And, if it's not about going to gym this year, okay, or losing 5 kgs or 10 kgs, if you're going to be able to do a check-in with practice, it would be nice to be able to actually just write down practice goals as well. And, it should actually filter back into your overall plan as an individual, as a part of a household, because it gives you an opportunity to be able to say, this is realistic or it's not, okay? To be able to write down goals for each month and then review them. John Maxwell does this really, really well, where he talks about the value of different goals and being able to write every day, not just journal, but to be able to write down goals every day, so that you can always check back and see how you're doing, either at the end of the month or, once every 3 months, whichever works for you. And doing this allows you to be able to tie this up with your annual goals for yourself, from a financial perspective, from a practice perspective, from a free time and family commitment perspective as well. Okay, so writing down weekly goals obviously breaks this down a little further, so that you can see, okay, I have so much of time this week, and therefore I can do this. For me personally, I think that a lot of the time I have been resistant to writing down weekly goals, simply because practice kind of like takes up time. And sometimes at the beginning of the week, I'll say to myself, okay, I'm going to have 5 hours free. By the end of the week, those 5 hours have disappeared. And I don't always get an opportunity to be able to look at this on a weekly basis. But on your day off, it is a good idea to be able to check out what's happened from a weekly perspective. Writing down daily goals is always a nice thing. For me, that's my to-do list in the mornings. Whether it's a mental note or it is something that I do at the end of the day, it's always nice to be able to start out knowing exactly what you want to accomplish in the next day. I think as practitioners, we often have to be mindful of the fact that clinical work first is generally our mindset. And I think when you're building up private practice, you have more free time. So it's nice to be able to get into the habit of doing some of your admin stuff around what it is that you want to do with regards to building up private practice. So when you have the time, you should definitely use it, rather than, spend it on other things and you feel like you haven't moved your practice forward. Okay, as you can imagine, goal setting is time consuming and very difficult to keep up with that habit. But the most important of this is that one of the most important functions of this is that you need to fulfill goal setting in order to be able to make your plan a reality. So probably, the most important thing for healthcare practitioners, as always I say, we prioritize clinical work above everything else. But goal setting, personal goals, journaling, diarizing things is also what we can use in order to be able to move the needle forward just a little bit every single day, rather than, 6 months down the line, oh my gosh, I haven't done anything to grow private practice. I haven't spoken to anybody. I haven't done any marketing. I haven't done this. I haven't done that. And that concludes our module 1.
Thanks, Ingrid. That was amazing. And I think it's obviously the start, and like you mentioned, the beginning, but it's a start of thinking of private practice. And I think, in the further modules, we'll obviously go into some of the other considerations that you want to go through. But I think you covered that really well. And then, we'll upload the other modules as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Oliver.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening. As always, stay tuned and we'll speak to you in the next episode.